Fantasy readers are not squeamish people. The books they finish and love are full of characters who spend hundreds of pages doing unforgivable things, and those books get 5 stars and a pre-ordered sequel. But one of those same readers might also reach a page or two of another book and put it down forever, without ever getting to the end. When you read the 1-star reviews to find out why, you'll find almost nobody can say exactly what happened. They say vague things like, "It was just too much," which is a strange thing to hear from someone who'd been enjoying characters who killed their way across a continent. The clearest case I know of comes with the numbers attached, because the author went and counted them himself. Mark Lawrence published Prince of Thorns in 2011. Its narrator is York Ankrath, a teenage prince who opens the book riding home from a village his men have just finished burning. And the book doesn't ease you into that. You meet him in the smoke. He's cheerful about it. Over the rest of the book, he gets worse rather than better. And Lawrence never once softens the lens to make him easier company. He burns what he can't carry off, and he kills men who trusted him that morning. And the narration hands you all of it in the same flat, unbothered voice from start to finish. Readers knew exactly what they'd picked up. The book sold, the trilogy got finished, and a great many people rode along with a teenage murderer for 3 volumes without ever threatening to stop. Prince of Thorns became known for something else entirely. It turned into the book people argued about, and the argument was never about the burning. There are a few lines in it referring to sexual violence, and those few lines did something that several hundred on-page deaths never managed. Lawrence eventually got tired enough of the whole thing to go and measure it. He counted every reference to rape in the novel. 61 words, out of roughly 85,000. He noted fairly dryly that he'd spent considerably more of the book describing doors. That arithmetic deserves a second of your attention, because it quietly demolishes the explanation most writers reach for first. If what drove readers out were a matter of how much ugliness sits on the page, 61 words couldn't possibly outweigh 85,000, and the burning in chapter 1 would have emptied the book long before anything else got a chance. The proportions are absurd. One part in 1400 did the damage, and the other 1399 parts, plenty of them genuinely horrible, didn't. I want to be careful with that number, because it's easy to hear it as a cheap point about readers overreacting, and I'm not making one. Lawrence wasn't making one either. 61 words can do real damage to a reader, and counting them settles nothing whatsoever about whether they should have. All the arithmetic establishes is that whatever those words were doing, they were doing it at a completely different level from everything around them. Page time was never the variable, which matters because the standard move when a difficult scene starts losing people is to edit it by the paragraph, shaving it down a line at a time in the hope that the trouble leaves along with the length. That's a writer carefully adjusting the one thing that had nothing to do with why readers left. So volume is out, which leaves the replacement theory sitting right there, and it's the one nearly everybody lands on next. Forget the amount, they say, the category is what does it. Killing belongs to one class of act and this belongs to another, and the second class is simply where the genre's permission ends. That sounds unarguable until you check it against the shelf, because fantasy has about 4 centuries of evidence pointing the other way. Every rung on fantasy's ladder of permission has a date stamped on it, and for as long as anyone's been counting, the ladder has only climbed. Take the middle of it. In 1996, George Martin has Jaime Lannister throw a 7-year-old boy out of a tower window, and the genre absorbs it without much trouble. Partly because we watch it happen as the boy, not as Jaime. We are horrified along with somebody, and sharing the horror keeps us comfortable. 2 years later, Martin does something far more aggressive. He hands a point-of-view chapter to Theon Greyjoy, which is to say the reader stops watching from outside and gets installed inside Theon's head for the duration. Theon takes Winterfell. When the Stark boys slip away and he can't bring himself to admit he's lost them, he has 2 Miller's sons killed, burned past recognition, and strung up in their place. You're in his skull for the calculation, for the ugly little rationalizations, and for the private relief afterward when the trick holds. Martin doesn't give you a single character standing beside you to be appalled on your behalf. He gives you Theon's own reasoning from the inside, and then leaves you in there with it. And then, in 2000, he does the same for Jaime, who over the following books turns into one of the most defended characters in modern fantasy by the readers of the very novel that opened with him committing attempted child murder. 6 years after that, Joe Abercrombie went further again. The Blade itself introduces Sandan Glokta, a man who tortures prisoners for a secret police force, and rather than keeping him at arm's length, it welds you to him. You get his interior voice on every page, a running stream of gallows wit and genuine self-disgust, plus a truly remarkable volume of complaints about stairs. And it's so funny and so unsparing about the man himself that readers routinely name him their favorite person in the series, which is a strange thing to catch yourself feeling about someone whose working day you've now watched several times. And look at what readers went on to do with those two men, because that's the part that really settles it. Jaime's turn is one of the most argued over character arcs the genre has, and the arguing is affectionate. People make the case for him. Glocta has spent close to 20 years now near the top of favorite character lists written by readers who can describe in detail what he does to prisoners in a basement. These weren't grudging tolerations that readers held their noses through. They were attachments, and they formed around exactly the acts that the category theory says no reader would ever accept. And how far back does that ladder actually go? A great deal further than either of those two. Milton's Paradise Lost in 1667 hands Satan the finest voice on the page and lets him argue his own case so well that people have been uneasy about it for 300 years. Glenn Cook's The Black Company in 1984 tells you about a mercenary outfit's atrocities from inside the outfit, in the voice of the man keeping its records. The individual rungs matter less than the direction they run in. For 3.5 centuries, the genre has kept widening what a protagonist may do, and kept shortening the distance between the reader and the doing of it, and at every widening, the readers came along. That's the part that ought to bother anybody holding the category theory. A ceiling that's been rising steadily since 1667 isn't functioning as a ceiling. If there were a class of act that readers flatly refuse, the ladder would have snapped at some rung in some decade, and it hasn't. Meanwhile, the thing that actually empties a novel is frequently smaller than what its reader forgave 20 pages earlier, and often less violent, and sometimes involves no physical harm at all. I'd go one further. If the category theory were right, you'd expect the exits to cluster, and every time I've asked around about abandoned books, I've gotten the opposite. One person walked away over a betrayal in which precisely nobody died, which is the sort of thing that shouldn't register at all next to the siege they'd happily read 40 pages earlier. Somebody else got through the siege and then quit over a single paragraph about a dog. Try to sort those into tidy categories of forbidden act, and the categories fall apart in your hands because the same reader who left one book over a thing will meet that identical thing somewhere else and never break stride. So whatever makes a reader quit, it can't be the act itself, because the same act that ends one book for them goes down fine in the next one. You've almost certainly met a version of this in your own drafts, where you can feel a scene doing something to readers and you can't name what it's doing. That gap between sensing a problem and being able to point at it is exactly what my free fantasy writing remedies are built for. It's a diagnostic library. 40 named writing problems with the fix for each, sorted into 7 categories, and there's no sign up. So the link in the description takes you straight to it. Now, if you've got this far and you're quietly thinking that all of this is overthinking a simple gut reaction, I want to give that idea its best possible run, because it's the explanation the internet has settled on, and it deserves better than a wave of the hand. It goes like this. Certain acts don't trigger disapproval so much as disgust, and disgust is old. It runs underneath reasoning. It evolved to keep our ancestors away from rot and contamination and disease. Once it fires, the argument goes, it doesn't merely make you dislike a thing, it reaches up into the deliberate reasoning part of you and hardens whatever moral judgment you were already forming, so that a reader who might otherwise have weighed the scene finds the verdict already delivered. And that story explains the lopsidedness beautifully, which is most of why it's popular. 100 deaths at the edge of a battle stay abstract. They arrive as a number, and numbers don't reach the old machinery. One bodily act at close range, described in specifics, goes straight past your reasoning and into the part of you that recoils from spoiled meat. On this account, the reader isn't evaluating your book at all. They're flinching, and then rationalizing the flinch afterward as a judgment about your writing. It's a satisfying theory. It's also conveniently a theory that arrives with a fix attached, which is most of the rest of why it's popular. If the problem is a reflex, then you manage the reflex the way you'd manage any other stimulus. You shorten the scene and move the camera back, and you strip out the specifics while keeping the implication, starving the event of the sensory detail that sets the reflex off. Fade to black at the door. Say it happened, in the past tense, 2 chapters later, in somebody's summary. This is genuinely the most common revision advice in the room whenever a writer says a scene is losing people, and I've given a version of it myself before I knew better. That effect got studied a great deal, and the studies kept finding it, and they were small and they were striking, which turns out to be the whole problem. Picture 20 labs running the same Disgust experiment. 4 of them get a striking result and 16 get nothing much. The 4 get published because a striking result is what a journal wants. The 16 go in a drawer because nobody ever built a career announcing that the interesting thing failed to happen. Read the published record a few years later and you'll count 4 confident papers saying yes and not one saying otherwise, and you'll conclude the case is closed. What you actually read was the surviving quarter. That's roughly the shape of what happened here. When someone eventually pooled around 50 of these disgust experiments together and corrected for exactly that imbalance, the effect on moral judgment shrank to something very close to zero. Not reversed, not scandalous, just far thinner than the confident version of the story ever let on. The mechanism a great deal of writing advice has been quietly resting on has much less holding it up than you'd guess from how often you hear it stated as a fact. Watch what happens to the writing advice once that support goes. If the reflex isn't doing the work, then trimming the scene stops being a fix and becomes a hope. And we've already got the test case sitting right in front of us because 61 words is about as trimmed as a passage can get before it stops being on the page at all. Lawrence's version was already the mild one. It was already the pulled back camera and the stripped specifics, the exact thing the reflex theory recommends. Readers left anyway. You can't shrink your way out of a problem that was never about size in the first place. And by this point, the pattern is starting to look less like a nervous system firing and more like a reader arriving at a considered opinion about a book. And watch where a writer goes once that trimming fails. Because the second step is the expensive one. Say he's shaved his difficult scene down twice already and readers are still putting the book down. So eventually he takes the scene out altogether. The consequence that made his third act work goes with it, and so does the reason anybody in the book was ever afraid of the man who did it. What he's left with is a novel that's lost the event it was built around and still hasn't fixed the thing driving people off, because that thing was never in the paragraph he kept editing. Some writers spend months on that loop. It's a miserable way to lose a book, and it's entirely avoidable once somebody tells them which question they're actually supposed to be asking. Which is where I have to admit I spent a long time looking in the wrong century. I assumed this was a modern argument, something that showed up alongside grimdark and comment sections and the general 21st century business of fighting about fiction in public. But it turns out the whole problem is a great deal older than the genre, and older than most of what we'd recognize as a novel. In 1757, David Hume wrote an essay about taste, and buried in it is a passage that reads like a description of somebody putting a novel down 400 pages in. Hume notices something odd about his own reading. He can pick up an old poem whose entire philosophy has since been thrown out and replaced twice over, or one where the princesses fetch their own water from the spring and the kings cook their own dinners, and none of it costs him a thing. The ideas are stale, the manners belong to a world that no longer exists, and he shrugs and reads on and enjoys the poem anyway. But when a poem shows vicious behavior and presents it, in his words, without being marked with the proper characters of blame and disapprobation, something in him refuses. He says that going along with it takes a very violent effort. Put that in plain language and bring it forward to what we read now, and it's remarkable. He'll accept your physics for free, he won't accept your values for free. Get the stars wrong or hand him a magic system that couldn't possibly work, and he'll carry the whole thing for you without complaint. Because he understands that's the deal fiction offers. Show him something monstrous and then decline to indicate what you make of it, and he stops being able to read the poem at all. And you already run this double standard yourself every time you open a fantasy novel. You'll take a world where the dead walk and iron burns the fair folk, and a man can rewrite the weather by singing at it. You'll take invented gods and invented physics, along with a few centuries of history that never happened. And you'll take all of it instantly and with no resistance at all, because that's the arrangement you agreed to on page 1 without a second's hesitation. Then somewhere around page 300, the same book asks you to accept that a particular act was acceptable, and every one of those muscles that were so relaxed about the dead walking suddenly locks up. That contrast is the whole phenomenon sitting inside one reader, and Hume caught it the better part of 3 centuries ago with nothing but a poem and his own attention. And the date on that is worth holding on to for a moment. 1757, before the novel had properly settled into the shape we use now, and a Scottish philosopher is already describing the precise experience a reader has today when a book loses them, putting it not in the event itself, but in the story's silence around the event. Philosophers have been arguing about the why of that ever since, and I should be straight with you, they haven't closed it. One camp says the refusal is a decision, the readers being invited to adopt a way of looking at the world that they'd rather not have in their head, and they decline the invitation, the way you decline to try on a coat you have no intention of wearing. Notice that this version makes the reader an active party. They could go along with you. They're choosing not to, because doing it would mean walking around afterward with a lens they didn't ask for, and a novel isn't worth that to them. The other camp says it isn't a decision at all, because a moral fact can't be made true simply by an author announcing it. Invent a second moon and the reader takes the moon, no argument. Because moons are the kind of thing an author gets to decide. Invent a country, a language, a dead empire, a law of magic that costs its user a year of life, and all of it lands. Because you've got unlimited authority over what's true inside your own world. Try to establish by declaration that what your hero just did was fine, and the reader can't make it true no matter how willing they are, because that isn't the kind of thing declaration can do to anybody. On this reading, the reader would go along with you if they could. They just can't get there. The way nobody can be talked into finding a joke funny. I'm not going to pretend to settle an argument that's been running since the 1750s in a fantasy writing video. And honestly, the split matters less than what both sides already agree on. Whichever camp is right, they agree on what the reader is refusing. Whatever the reader is doing when they close your book, they're responding to the story's own stance toward what happened, and not to the happening. Which is genuinely useful right up until you sit down at your own manuscript, and then it's useless. Philosophy names the disease and hands over nothing to find it with. It won't say which of 400 pages is doing this, or what specifically is missing from that page, or what would have to be written to repair it. It describes what happens inside the reader, but the fix is a sentence you have to write, and it can't tell you which sentence or where. If you want the whole build rather than one diagnosis, that's what my writing system is for. It's the complete 5-phase blueprint, blank page to finished manuscript, one payment with lifetime access, and more than 100 writers have gone through it. It's live now, and the link is in the description. Because the sentence really is the level this operates at, and I can show you exactly where. Picture yourself reading. Something ugly has just happened on the page. You're still inside the scene, and somewhere in the next paragraph or two, you start doing a thing you've never once caught yourself doing. You go looking. Not for a lecture and not for a punishment, just for some sign that the author knows what he just put in front of you. What you want to know is whether the author has a position on what he just showed you, or whether he'll show you anything at all and say nothing about it either way. Almost every time you get your answer inside a page, and the form that answer takes is much smaller than you'd expect. Sometimes it's another character. Somebody in the room registers what happened, and that's the whole intervention. They don't have to condemn it, and they barely have to speak. A brother who goes quiet for the rest of the ride and is still quiet at dinner will do the entire job. And so will a servant who finds a reason not to come back into the hall. That one reaction establishes that the people in this world judge what they see too, and that the reader isn't the only one who found it worth noticing. And it costs the author about 11 words. Watch for it the next time a story takes you somewhere unpleasant and keeps you comfortable, and one of these will turn up almost every time. Usually so small nobody would clock it deliberately. It's the oldest stagecraft there is. Somebody at the edge of the frame reacts on the reader's behalf, and the reader relaxes because the room has just been confirmed as sane. Other times, nobody in the scene says a word, and what's doing the work is whose head the author has put you in. You can be all the way inside a character's head, following every one of his justifications in order, and still refuse him. So being close to someone was never the same as agreeing with him. But closeness with nothing to push against starts to read like agreement. Because if his interpretation is the only one the book ever puts on the page, then by default, his interpretation is the book's. That's the trap Martin dodges by making Theon's reasoning visibly panicked and self-serving rather than persuasive. And it's the one you fall into when you write him a justification so airtight that the reader can't tell it apart from your own opinion. In the hardest version of this, there's nobody in the room to react and no other head to put the reader in, so the prose itself has to carry the whole thing. It does that through what the narration chooses to linger on, and through the temperature of a single well-picked word, and it can also do it by letting the very next scene charge him for it. Television leans on this constantly. The reliable trick for making a viewer comfortable with a monstrous lead is to stage everybody around him as worse, and then let the camera treat him as the reasonable man in the room. Nothing about the character changes. Everything about how you receive him does. And most viewers never notice the arrangement being made on their behalf. That works in both directions, and the second direction is the part worth keeping. If staging can make a monstrous man read as reasonable, then staging can just as easily make a defensible man read as monstrous, and writers hit that second failure constantly, without ever understanding what went wrong. Your hero does something hard but justified. The prose stays flat and hurried because you were in a rush to get to the next scene, nobody in the room registers anything, And the reader closes the chapter having quietly decided your protagonist is a person they don't want to travel with. You never wrote the villain, you just never included anything that says he isn't one. Which brings me to the thing I actually wanted to say, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to see it. The sentence a reader is hunting for isn't the one where the act happens. It's the one just after. Look at what that does to an argument you've certainly watched go past. A Court of Thorns and Roses is Sarah J. Maas's romantasy series, and Rhysand is the Fey Lord at the middle of it, a man who spends much of the first book as the heroine's captor and antagonist, in scenes readers have been arguing about ever since, and who becomes the romantic lead of everything that follows. That argument isn't really a fight about events. Both sides can recite what he does in the first book, and both sides broadly agree on the list. Where they split is on whether the series ever indicates what it makes of that list, and on how the narration goes on to position him in the pages afterward. The events are agreed. The marking is the thing people are fighting about, and readers arrive at opposite verdicts on identical pages depending on what they think the author means them to feel about that list. There's a specific move in there that's worth naming, because you can do it accidentally. When a later book goes back and re-explains an earlier act supplying the reasons that were withheld at the time, it doesn't only change how the act reads going forward, it reaches backward and repositions the scene the reader already lived through. Handled well, that's one of the most satisfying things long fiction can do to you, and half the pleasure of a reread comes from it. Handled carelessly, the reader feels managed because they can tell the author has changed his story about something they watched happen. And that suspicion is much harder to recover from than the original scene ever was, since it's no longer about a character at all. It's about whether the narrator is being straight with them. Take any scene you like and run the test yourself. Version 1 ends with your protagonist getting what he came for, and the chapter closes on his satisfaction. Version 2 is identical up to the final beat, except the second character can't meet his eyes afterward, and he notices. And the noticing is one sentence long. Nothing's been removed. The act is exactly as bad, exactly as detailed, exactly as long, and no reader shown that scene on its own would call version 2 the tamer draft. They're two different books. Readers will follow one of them and leave the other. And if you ask the leavers why, a good number would tell you the second version was the less brutal one. Same brutality, line for line, start to finish. What the second version has is a witness, one sentence showing what the act looked like to somebody who was standing there. And the reason that single sentence carries so much weight is that it answers the only question the reader was actually asking. They weren't asking you to be gentler. They came to a fantasy novel about a teenage warlord, so gentleness was never on the list of things they wanted. What they wanted was to know they could keep trusting the narrator, and a narrator who watches something like that happen and has no reaction whatsoever has told them something about himself that they can't unlearn. So walk that back into your own draft, because this is the point where it stops being an idea and turns into a job you can do this afternoon. You don't have to cut anything. That's worth saying plainly, because the instinct that arrives with all of this is deletion, and deletion is almost always the wrong tool. It's also the expensive one, since the scene is usually there for a reason, and removing it costs you whatever that reason was. The pass I'd run instead has 2 steps, and it's a search rather than a rewrite. First, find the worst thing your protagonist does. Now find the sentence that tells me how to feel about it. If step 2 comes up empty, you found your gap, and it's a much smaller and much more repairable thing than it felt like a minute ago. What's sitting there is a missing sentence in one specific chapter, and the chapter already identified itself 30 seconds earlier in step 1. That's a small, contained job, not a structural rebuild. Run it honestly though, because the failure mode here is finding the marking where there isn't one. An author's own knowledge of their characters doesn't count for anything here. The protagonist regrets it. You know that regret as well as you know his name. It's perfectly visible to you on a reread, and none of it ever reached the page, because the chapter got written by somebody already carrying everything there is to know about him. The reader arrives with nothing, so the test is strict, and it's the only strict thing in this whole video. Point at the words. If you can't put a finger on an actual line of text and say this one, the marking isn't in the book. However clearly it exists in your head. What goes into that space can be almost anything, provided it genuinely lives inside the story. A reaction from somebody who was present is the cheapest and most reliable version. And if you only ever learn one of these, learn that one. Because it takes a clause and it works in nearly every scene you'll ever write. A consequence that surfaces 2 chapters later does the same job with more reach, though it charges you setup to get there. That setup is real work. because something has to be planted early enough that the payoff 2 chapters later still reads as a consequence. What about the protagonist doing the noticing himself? That's the hardest of the 3 to write and the strongest when it holds, because it keeps everything inside the head you've already sealed the reader into, and it doesn't hand him an excuse on the way through. Let me walk one all the way through so you can watch the whole thing in motion. Say your protagonist executes a prisoner who'd surrendered, because keeping him alive endangers the people she's protecting. Step 1 finds it instantly. That's the worst thing she does. Step 2 goes hunting for the line that tells me what the book makes of it. And in a lot of drafts, there simply isn't one, because you wrote the chapter knowing her reasoning was sound, and the prose came out efficient. She does it. She wipes the blade, the company moves on before dark. The reader, who doesn't have your notes, watches a woman kill a man who'd put down his weapon, and then watches her whole company move on as if nothing happened. Now add one sentence. Her second in command doesn't speak to her that evening, and she notices. That's it. The execution stays, her reasoning stays sound, and you haven't argued with her, or apologized for her, or paused the book to explain that this was a hard call in a hard war. What you've done is establish that the world she lives in contains somebody who thinks it was worth being quiet about, and the reader can now judge her for themselves, which is all they ever wanted to do. What it must never be is you, the author, stepping onto the page to deliver a verdict. Go back to the word Hume used all the way back at the start of this, when he said a vicious act has to be marked. He said marked and he did not say condemned, and that distinction is the entire craft of it. A book that pauses to announce that this was wrong has abandoned the story in order to make an announcement, and readers can hear an author clearing their throat from a mile off. You aren't grading the act for them. You're establishing that the world of this book holds a position, and then getting out of the way and letting them grade it themselves against that. And that's the whole shape of it. Your scene keeps everything. The killing stays, the ugliness stays, your teenage warlord stays exactly as unpleasant as you needed him to be, and the book gains one line it should have had all along. That short list of scenes that quietly empties a novel of its readers has one thing in common, and it was never the acts themselves. In every single case, the author went quiet at precisely the moment his reader was listening hardest. Stay in the room for that one moment, and the readers who would have closed the book are still with you at the end of it. That's the hero half of it. The villain half is stranger because with an antagonist you can do everything I just described. Mark the act, stage the reaction, hand the reader every signal I've given you today, and still end up with somebody nobody takes seriously for a second. Why that keeps happening to modern fantasy villains is the whole of the video on screen right now. It's this same question turned around. Go watch that one next and take your antagonist with you.